Hi, I am Dr. Samir bin Osman, and in this video we're going to talk about the principles of histology and physiology. Histology is the study of the organization of biological tissues, and physiology is the study of their functions. So biological functions need to operate harmoniously and within nominal limits to attain what we call homeostasis, i.e. equilibrium. And remember, we talked about this as a general overarching principle in all of the sciences. Is the tendency to go towards equilibrium. And they do this to ensure their survival, to ensure their growth, defense, and reproduction, as we spoke about in the video about biology. And in order to achieve this, the cells are organized into structures that we call tissues that are dictated by their specialized functions. And so, depending on the physical needs of a tissue, cells will produce specific proteins to enable, for example, abrasion resistance, such as keratin for skin and nails, and you can see how the structure of keratin is solid, or secrete proteins that will go into the environment and provide elasticity, like elastin for skin and tendons, and you can see the structure of elastin very different from that of keratin, and you can see that it's able to stretch. Or they can secrete proteins that act as cement to hold tissues together, like collagen, or to provide partial rigidity, i.e. proteins using proteins that are fused with sugars that are called proteoglycans. So you can see proteo on one side and glycan on the other. And that gives them kind of partial rigidity, and you find proteoglycans in cartilage, for example. Or to provide full rigidity, that is collagen hardened with calcium that you find in bones. Another example is contractility, which is kind of this proteins that are specialized in sliding on top of each other, and you can see here actin sliding over myosin in muscles, skeletal muscles or others. Or provide flexible storage, as in fat cells, in fat tissues, and fat cells are able to inflate at many times their volume, and they're able to adapt to changes in lipid structure and storing more or less lipid. So, and many more examples. These are just kind of some examples of the types of tissues that will enable the function. And remember, form follows function, and you can see the form of those proteins follows the function that they are bound to operate under. And so, in addition to these kind of proteic structures, the tissues will organize into what we call superstructures that will be adapted to fluid transport, such as blood vessels, to exchanges such as kidneys, to compound production such as livers and various glands, to blood circulation or pumping like the heart, etc. And how these work, that's kind of the field of physiology. So let's talk a little bit more about physiology. And we're going to take a little bit of the same approach that we took with biology, with the functions, and this time we're going to talk about them from the physiological standpoint. So for energy generation and respiration, like we said, it's basically the freeing of electrons from compounds and making them go to other compounds, and that energy of electrons is the energy that we extract from respiration. So respiration requires oxygen, and so where do we get oxygen from? The energy contained in the carbohydrates and lipids is freed by respiration, which, like I said, in its most efficient form is going to require oxygen, and generates CO2 as a byproduct. So these need to be transported. How do they transport it? So the transport of oxygen and CO2 is achieved by what we call the cardiorespiratory system. So cardiovascular plus respiratory system. That's composed of air intake and exhaust, that's mouth and nose, air transport, that's trachea and bronchia, etc. And then gas exchange modules in the lungs, where thin film alveoli, as you can see here, are threaded with very thin blood vessels that we call capillaries to allow the passive movement of oxygen and CO2. So what do we mean by passive? It basically goes from high pressure to low pressure. So whenever there's a high pressure of oxygen on one side and low pressure on the other side, oxygen is going to just flow passively, and vice versa. And it so happens that in the alveoli of the lungs, the pressure of oxygen outside i.e. like in the alveoli, is higher than the one in the blood. And so the oxygen is going to flow in the blood. And it so happens that CO2 is actually the opposite. So the CO2 in the blood, when it arrives at the alveoli, is higher than the one in the air inside the alveoli. So the CO2 is going to go out. How these pressures are managed, that's kind of the whole system, the cardiorespiratory system. And so the oxygen, once it goes into the bloodstream, is going to go inside the red blood cells, and then in red blood cells it's going to diffuse passively to reach the proteins basically the red blood cells are completely filled with a protein called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is a very specific protein that has actually an iron compound inside, surrounded by protein. That's what, like, hemoglobin. And that's kind of very specialized in binding oxygen and CO2. And I just want to note here that CO2 is toxic to the body because for one thing, it's going to compete with the oxygen to bind hemoglobin. And so the more CO2 there's there, the less capacity the hemoglobin will have to transport oxygen. And so that's the first problem. So that's why we need to get rid of CO2. The second thing is that CO2 is going to dissolve in the blood, so not in the blood cells, but in the liquid of the blood itself, into carbonic acid, and that's going to drop the pH of the blood, and that's going to cause a whole lot of problems that you don't want to get. So that's why you need to get rid of the CO2. And so those red cells will be pumped into basically like every cell in the body via high pressure blood vessels called the arteria. They're depicted here in red, and you can see they have a thick membrane surrounding them, just because they're like high pressure vessels. And they need to maintain this high pressure first to get it quickly to all the tissues and cells, but also to maintain that high pressure that allows O2 to go from the high pressure where it is to the lower pressure in the cells passively. And then in the cells, it will go into the mitochondria, which is the organelle within the cell that's specialized in energy generation from respiration. And it's going to go into a complex cycle that's called the Krebs cycle. And basically, it's going to transfer electrons into many compounds. And at the end, it will generate a lot of electrons that will be bound to the energy molecule called ATP. And then it will generate CO2 as a byproduct, which means that CO2 will be at a high pressure in those cells. And so CO2 will move from the cells to the other vessels, which are the veins. And the veins are low volume vessels. So they're going to go, again, CO2 from high volume to low volume. And so when they go into the veins, they go back to the alveoli, and then the cycle restarts. And that's how, in principle, the respiration, the respiratory cardiorespiratory system works. So let's talk a little bit more about other functions. So let's talk about absorption and digestion. So let's talk first about absorption. So nutrients are absorbed by the intestinal cells and are transferred to the blood capillaries that surround the intestines in order to be distributed to the body. And so water is absorbed directly into the blood passively, basically from high to low concentration. And then water-soluble nutrients will be actively transported from the intestine cells to the blood. So what do we mean by actively transported? There will be selective proteins called receptors that will sit on the membrane of intestine cells, and they will catch, each one will be specialized in a special nutrient, sugar, etc., etc. It will catch it, and then it will take it inside the cell, and then from inside the cell, they will have also receptors on the other side that take it to the blood vessel. So that's what we mean by actively transported. And then water-insoluble nutrients, i.e. lipids that are non-polar molecules, these cannot transition directly to the blood because they're not soluble in the blood, because the blood is water-based. And so they will be made soluble in the blood by special proteins that bind them to form what we call lipoproteins. So lipo for lipid, protein for protein. And so basically they act as surfactants. And we mentioned surfactants many times in chemistry and engineering. So surfactants will be able to solubilize lipids into the bloodstream and transport them their way. Nutrients are distributed throughout the body, either for immediate use by the various cells, or they will be directed to specific structures for short-term storage in the form of sugars in the liver and muscle cells, or for longer term storage as fat in adipocytes, and then they can be converted to sugars as needed in the future. But how do these nutrients get extracted from the food in the first place? Well, that happens through digestion. So digestion is performed by the mechanical action of the digestive system that's kind of try to extract things mechanically, but it's going to be mostly performed by chemical action by the enzymes and the bacteria. And so there are specific enzymes that are made by the liver, and they will go into and they're also made by the intestinal cells. They will go into the intestine and start kind of breaking down those food into basically the nutrients. So we have the amylase that's going to be cut in sugars, and you can see it here. You have the lipase that's going to be cutting the lipids into smaller lipids, and then you have pepsin, which is specialized in cutting proteins. We have also chymotrypsin. We have many other enzymes, and all of these will basically start the digestion process in the liver, basically. And just to mention, the lipase activity will be actually enhanced and activated by the bile that's produced by the liver and stored in the gallbladder. You know, the kind of the green liquid. So in addition to that, we have bacterial action that's very important for digestion. And the bacteria, basically, they live in the intestines and are essential components of the digestive system. That's kind of part of the outsourced function that we spoke about in the video about the principles of biology. And so those bacteria, they will break down indigestible long sugars, also called fibers, to make them digestible, and also produce essential vitamins and some essential amino acids. They have many uses in the digestive system. And so now that we have digested the food, extracted the value that we need from it, what do we do with the rest? And now that comes into waste management. So waste management is a way to get rid of the rest of the metabolism, toxic products that come from the metabolism, as well as the rest of the food that hasn't been digested. And it's mainly kind of managed by the liver and the kidneys. So let's talk about the liver for a little bit. So liver cells that live in the liver, they will deactivate some toxic waste products that come from the metabolism using specialized enzymes that are within them. And then they will secrete the byproducts of those toxic waste products into the intestines within the bile that's contained within the gallbladder, like we said, the green liquid. And so the gallbladder is going to secrete the bile. The bile is going to go along with the dead bacteria and the undigested foods, and that's what's going to become the feces that are expelled from the organism. On the other side, we have the kidneys that operate as basically a sequence of very elaborate exchange microtubes that are called nephrons, and they exchange fluids with the blood, and basically they remove toxic components from the blood like urea, which results from the protein breakdown, and also other toxic components. And also they have another function, which is keeping the blood volume nominal, i.e. within acceptable range, so not too diluted, not too concentrated. And so they will extract more or less water from the blood depending on what's needed. And then what's extracted goes with the urea and other components and becomes urine. So let's talk now about protection and defense functions. And defense in complex systems, including human systems, will be done through the immune system. And it has a redundancy built into it, so it works through a process of cellular immunity and also a process of protein immunity called the complement system. So let's talk about the cellular immunity. So we have white blood cells that are immunity or immune cells. These white blood cells are produced in a network of small organs that are called lymph nodes, which are connected via lymphatic means slow from Greek, vessels. So those lymphatic vessels that you see here in green, they actually run alongside blood vessels, so they're very close to blood vessels, and that's what allows white blood cells to diffuse from the lymphatic vessels into the blood vessels in case they're needed. And basically they're distributed throughout the body. And so the system is made of early warning cells, which upon detection of foreign particles, could be bacterial or viral proteins, etc., and we call those antigens, they will start a response and they will amplify the response. Remember the principle in biology that we set of the amplified response. So, functions that respond to small signals need to be amplified. So there will be like a chain of amplification. So then the amplification of this response will end up transmitting fragments of those particles that they detected to effector cells. And those effector cells, they will generate the attack. What is the attack? The attack is the production of a specific type of proteins that exactly match those fragments that have been detected, like a key in a keyhole. And those specific proteins are called antibodies. You can see here in teal color, antibodies that are surrounding or like attaching to the particles that they identified, which is called the antigen. And so these antibodies, when they attach to the particles that are in the bacteria or the virus, they're not going to kill them or anything like that. They're just basically going to mark them. And they're going to mark them for targets for killing cells. So you have basically three steps. You have, the early warning, you have the effector cells that make the antibodies, and then you have the killing cells that kill everything that is attached to these antibodies. And that's how the system works. And every time we have, many steps, we have amplification of the signal. In parallel, those effector cells, they also do another important function. They will take those fragments that they collected from the bacteria and the virus, and they will take them to other cells called memory cells. And those memory cells, they will keep a snapshot of these foreign particles, and they will basically transmit them to their daughter cells for years, and they will keep them for years so that they can produce the antibodies quickly in the next encounter. And this feature is actually what's used to make vaccines. So the vaccines are basically just fragments of the bacteria or the virus that we want to vaccinate against that are injected into your body. And so they will activate your own system to activate your own memory cells to keep a memory of it. And then if you get infected with the actual disease, the memory cells will kick in right away, making the antibodies, and then the killing cells will kill the virus or the bacteria right away. So that's kind of the principle of the vaccine. Now, in parallel to this cellular immune system, we have another redundant system, which is the complement system. And it's made of about 50 different types of proteins that are produced by liver cells and secreted into the bloodstream, and they're waiting for any event to happen. They're just like sitting there and waiting, circulating and waiting. So among them, we have early detection proteins, like they're called initiator proteins, and they will react also to foreign particles, and they will activate a cascade of reactions. So each one will activate many others, each one will activate many others. We'll have signal amplification. We talked about that. And so at the end of the activation chain of the complement system, they will activate the final proteins, and the final proteins will basically destroy the bacteria, for example. And you can see here the complement proteins, the last chain of proteins, they will form a hole in the bacterial membrane, and they will cause basically the liquids inside the membrane to escape and basically the bacteria to die. So this is kind of how the immunity works and how the redundancy works in the immune system. So let's talk now about the coordination of functions. And like we said, the coordination happens at multiple levels, and it needs to happen at multiple levels because the processes happen at multiple speeds. And so we have the needs to regulate within seconds for breathing or heart regulation, etc. Or we have the need to regulate at, within minutes for blood coagulation, or within hours for digestion, immunity, and growth, etc. So depending on the speed of adaptation that's required, there are two main coordination and regulation systems that exist. The third one that we spoke about, which is epigenetic modifications, we're not going to talk about it here. And it's a whole world in and of itself, but just know that it exists. But I'm just going to focus on the two main coordination systems, the autonomous nervous system and the hormonal system. And both are interlinked, by the way, and basically everything is more or less interlinked. So let's talk about the autonomous nervous system. So the autonomous nervous system is a network of nerves that connect to practically every tissue in the organism, and they will enable rapid response to physiological and environmental events, and has two counterbalancing components. Remember, the the principle about the balance between inhibitors and stimulators. Well, this is one of those examples. So we have what we call the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. So let's start with the parasympathetic system. So the parasympathetic system, sorry, I made a mistake. The parasympathetic is the one above. That's the rest and digest system, and it's therefore activated most of the time to keep the heart rate low, to keep the blood vessels open, the digestive system, blood vessels in the digestive system open and less open in the skeletal muscles, etc. So it's basically just keeping you calm, rested, digesting, etc. Whereas the sympathetic system, the one below, sorry again about the mistake, intervenes in case of need, either intense physical exercise or stress or needing to escape, and it causes what we call the fight or flight response by inducing the opposite effects of the sympathetic system, which is increasing heart rate, opening blood vessels in the skeletal muscles, closing them in the digestive system, and many other things. In addition to these two counterbalancing systems, there is a third one, and because of that's needed because of the complexity of the intestinal absorption and the blood exchanges that it requires. And so there is a dedicated third nervous system that surrounds the digestive system, and it's called, especially the intestines, it's called the enteric. Enteric means intestinal nervous system, which can function quasi-independently from the rest of the autonomous nervous system. And you can see here in fluorescence microscopy the intestinal autonomous nervous system that surrounds the intestine. Now, the second regulation is through hormones, and it's kind of a little bit slower than the nervous regulation, and it's interconnected with the hardwired system. The hormones are regulatory molecules that are produced and released into the bloodstream in response to activating events, and they will diffuse through the bloodstream to reach their target cells and induce their intended effects. So some hormones only act on specific organs, some hormones act on all organs, it's depending on their function. So usually their effects activate also a feedback mechanism that's going to stop their work by stopping their production and degrading the ones that are already in circulation to keep the physiological functions balanced. Again, one of the principles of biology is seeking equilibrium. So you cannot have hormones being active all the time. So they get activated, they do their work, and there are sensors that sense that their work has been done that deactivate them. And so they also operate under 3 time scales, basically. And how do they do it is through the chemical structures that they have. So some chemical structures will enable fast or moderate or slow action. So let's talk about each one of them. So the hormones that are derived from single amino acids, like epinephrine here, they will have rapid responses. So sometimes within minutes, they will start acting. And they will have also short lifetimes. So within, maybe less than 10 minutes, they will be deactivated because they will have explosive effects. And epinephrine actually is one of the mediators, the main mediators of the sympathetic autonomous system, which is the fight and flight response. So it's going to increase heart rate, it's going to open the vessel, it's going to do many things very quickly. But then you cannot have it sustained like that. So it needs to be deactivated quickly as well. In parallel to that, you have hormones that are made of proteins, so which are larger molecules and which will have longer lifetimes, like insulin for glucose intake, and these have a lifetime of hours. So they work under the kind of the span of minutes to hours, let's say. And then you have another time scale that's made with hormones that are derived from lipids, especially from a lipid called cholesterol, which is a lipid that's kind of not miscible in the blood, and so it requires a special lipoproteins in order to transport it, and that's why it takes longer time for its work and activation. And so some of the hormones that are made from cholesterol are steroids, like progesterone and testosterone, and many hormones that end in "-one" actually are derived from cholesterol. And so these hormones generally have slower responses and long lifetimes, and that's in line with their functions. And typically steroids functions are growth and reproduction. And so these functions, they require hours in order to to operate. And with that, we came to the end of the video on the principles of histology and physiology. I welcome your comments. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you in the next video.